You really should not encourage me. You should not encourage me. Do I want to talk about the Dust Bowl? Of course I want to talk about the Dust Bowl. I have been waiting my entire life for someone to ask me about the Dust Bowl, so let's get into it. So I'm responding to this comment on the video I made about, believe it or not, the collectivization of farming under Stalin in the early part of the 20th century, which is not really my area of expertise. But you know what I do know a lot about? The motherfucking Dust Bowl. So let's get into it. So first of all, I want to say that my source for this video is this fantastic book by Timothy Egan called The Worst Hard Time. I read it when it came out in the late aughts, early teens, I think. And it was the funniest thing as I was reading this book, people would look at the cover and read it and like shudder and like run away. People were like, why would you want to read that? And I was like, why would you not want to read all the juicy details about how the Dust Bowl happened? So for those of you who maybe have heard the term the Dust Bowl, don't really know what it is, or don't remember, the Dust Bowl was a period of time in the early 1930s where in the middle part of the United States there were massive like daylight blackening dust storms, like days long, weeks long dust storms that blanketed the middle part of the country. So this phenomenon grew out of a very specific type of environmental degradation that happened as a result, come to find out, of the genocide against the Native Americans and the settlement of the West. So in the early 1800s, the United States purchased this huge amount of territory from France, from Louisiana to Oregon. But they just purchased what were essentially like colonial dibs on this territory. Like, they didn't govern this territory. There was no outposts. There weren't really any towns except for New Orleans in this territory. Like, this was not territory that the United States could really call its own in any real sense, because it was essentially just territory that was owned by the tribes who lived there. And so how could the United States get to the point where it was actually like governing these territories? Well, you had to settle the territories. And part of that settlement was the displacement of the Native Americans through war. They sent the army out there after the Civil War and decimated the Plains tribes. But they also moved people in. They moved people in by giving away land. And of course, people wanted free land. Like, you know, you do have to motivate people to move out of their homes and their family structures, especially in this time period. Like, community, family ties were much stronger. And so if you're going to get people to move from where they've established their lives into this new territory, you're going to have to incentivize them. And they did that by giving away land. And so the United States did this for the better part of a century, gave away land to white folks to get them to move from the East Coast into the interior of the country and displace the native peoples who lived there. So they did this for the better part of a century. Towards the end of that century, we start getting to a point where most of the farmland that was high quality has already been given away. We're talking the late 1800s. People have already moved into the Midwest, the lower Midwest. They've moved into Texas. They've moved into California. They've moved into Oregon and Washington. They've moved into Montana and Wyoming. They've moved into Colorado. Like, they've moved into all these places. They moved into Nebraska. They've moved into Kansas. There are people in all these places. They have given away that land. Kind of amazing. It only took a century for them to give away all this land and to displace all of the people who live there. Like, it's kind of bananas. So the United States breaks its treaty with the Cherokee tribe, who was promised the territory of Oklahoma when they were forcibly removed from northern Georgia. The promise, hollow and, inadequate as it was that yes, we are forcibly removing you from the territory in northern Georgia and tearing you away from your homes and leading you to face starvation and death and all of those horrible things. But this territory here in Oklahoma is territory that you now own and you can have forever. They didn't stick to that. So in the late 1800s, they start giving this land away. And this is land that has taken this long to give away simply because it was seen as not that desirable. Now, it is a wonderful and rich ecosystem. It existed, very abundantly for thousands of years, but it is not particularly suited to Western European style agriculture. It has a very thin layer of topsoil and a very thick layer of grassland that holds that topsoil down. And the buffalo that are native to that area, when they would graze, they grazed really lightly, so they didn't pull up the roots of the grass. Cows tend to pull up the roots of the grass, but buffalo don't pull up the roots of the grass, and deer also don't pull up the roots. And so the roots could stay there, and the buffalo would graze. And it's basically like the topsoil stayed down because of this grassland. But these farmers came in, and they were called sod busters because they would break up this grassland root system in order to plow the land and start farming. Now, this in and of itself, it's not great, but if you then plant, then you are replacing the grass with another crop that is also holding the soil with a root system. So these farmers came in the late 1800s and they started growing wheat because that was the main crop that would work in this area. They started growing wheat, and turns out there were a couple of really big wars that happened in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, starting with a couple of wars that the British were up to, and then the First World War. So the demand for wheat was enormous. And so these farmers were growing wheat in this very marginal land, not super productive area of land. But because the price of wheat was so high, they kept those crops going. They did pretty well. But then in the 1920s, there started being a lot of speculation in the stock market. People saw that the price of wheat was so high. They started speculating. They started trading in wheat futures, started driving the price of wheat up really high, which caused speculators to come in to buy up land that maybe nobody wanted and to put that under wheat production. And they put more and more land under wheat production. So this whole area of the country was just wheat, and it was all being sold at these inflated prices and essentially being like stored in grain silos because they were speculating on this market. So then the stock market crashed, and the market for wheat also crashed. And these farmers had stockpiles of wheat and no one to sell it to. And their business model was only sustainable with these wheat prices up as high as they had been, but they were so low now that people just walked away from the farms. They just walked away. And so you can imagine what happened was that there was no crop to hold the topsoil down. So these millions and millions and millions of acres where they had broken up the root system of the grass and planted crops now had nothing to hold that dirt in place. And that grass that they had dug up was slow growing. You couldn't just, no one was there reseeding it. Nobody was there fixing the problem. They just walked away from these farms. And so the winds of the plains just blew that dust for years and years and years in the early 1930s all around that area of the country.